So I have pleasure now in introducing Joanna Baniewska, uh, who is going to introduce tonight's speaker.
I'm being introduced as doing the introduction. So it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Chris Sandom, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex. And he leads the Sandom Group, which is focused on rewilding, as you might expect, and conservation biology, based on research in ecology, and that's behavioral, paleo, and community ecology. But he's also the founder of Rewilding Sussex, which is a community group, as well as the consultancy Wild Business. And today, Chris will talk to us about, drumroll, rewilding. And so it is, again, my great pleasure to bring him onto the stage, and he'll talk to us about rewilding in the UK. So without further ado, over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much. It's very nice to be here this evening to talk to you virtually. I'm hoping you can see my screen. You've probably got various things popping up that I'm hoping I can hide from it. But hopefully it's looking all right. Is it, Joanna? You can get a nod. Excellent. So yeah, really looking forward to being here to talk to you about rewilding in Britain. And my background, oh god, that's encouraging. It's all gone blank on my end. So let's see how it's. We tested it out a couple of times. Okay, it seems to come back. Yes, talk to you a little bit about rewilding in Britain. Now, my journey in rewilding started during my PhD. I was up at the Allerdale.
Loud enough.
Wilderness Reserve.
Okay, I'll turn it down.
I think Norma, you're not muted, so we're getting you as well by the sound of it. Hopefully, everyone can hear me. So yes, up at Allerdale, which is up in Scotland, up in the Scottish Highlands. I was doing my PhD looking at wild boar behaviour, seeing how they influence the environment, see how they could help restore that Caledonian forest ecosystem. And as I was going through my PhD, I was enjoying that whole the interaction of looking at how mammals can change ecosystems through the processes and traits they have and the processes they drive. And it was really fascinating, but it wasn't really till the end of my PhD when I came across this idea of rewilding, when I first started reading a little bit about it and realized that my PhD actually was all about rewilding. I just hadn't heard of the term at the time. And ever since then, it's really captivated me as this really interesting idea for how we can go about doing restoration. But as I'm sure you're familiar with, or many of you will be familiar with, it's often said that rewilding means different things to different people. And I think that really is the case. And there are various places, organizations that have created lists of rewilding projects around the country. Different organizations create different lists. They have different ideas about what makes a project a rewilding project or not. And in 2020, Sophie Wynne-Jones and myself, we kind of collated that list, looked at a few of our own, and tried to work out what is these kind of unique features that make a project a rewilding project. And what we quickly realized was, while there's some consistent ideas, there's also a lot of diversity. There's a lot of variety in here about what people think of rewilding, whether rewilding is thought of, what other people think about rewilding. People who are doing the project themselves might not think about it as rewilding. So there's lots of variability within that. So I felt the only way I could really start this presentation was to give you kind of my view, my interpretation of what rewilding is. And I think that's quite reasonable. And I actually think in the sense that it's not necessarily a criticism of rewilding for it to be a diverse concept. In fact, I think when we think about it, most words are quite diverse. If you think about conservation as a term, a lot of people have different ideas about what conservation is all about, how you go about doing it. If you think about agriculture, there's lots of different ways of doing agriculture, and people will come across quite diverse perspectives about what they're doing and how it all works. So rewilding is a diverse idea, but here's my take essentially. So I think there's a primary goal for what a rewilding project is looking to do. And I think it's all about creating self-sustaining complex ecosystems that are allowed the freedom to evolve and change as dictated by nature and natural processes. So this core idea of it is kind of letting nature take its course rather than seeking to control it and working it out for itself. And that's quite different to a lot of other land uses. And I think it's quite unique, and one that I think is really important to focus on. And this idea of natural processes really comes across in this in the rewilding world a lot. So that's his primary goal in sense of it's quite a big goal. It's broad. It's not particularly specific, and I think that is quite important. But there are lots of typically expected, hoped for outcomes of rewilding. So one of the things you hope is that if you create this complex ecosystem, that it is this self-sustaining and it's going to maintain those kind of functions into the future. It might change over time, but it retains that ability to be to direct its own fate and be variable. There's a lot of hope that it's going to increase biodiversity, whether that's increase biodiversity on site or increase the diversity between sites or in general. But there's a hope for that it kind of feeds into this idea of conservation and restoration. There's going to be a benefit to nature and it's going to support a greater variety of life. There's also a lot of hope for that it will increase the diversity and the delivery of the benefits nature provides people. Again, that's quite a difficult thing to do because all the different things that people want are really diverse. You know, there are no two people are the same, no two places are the same. It's going to be quite difficult and quite diverse. And you know, I take a lot of people to somewhere like Knepp, and they really enjoy it, and they feel like it's this wild place, and they relate to it, and they enjoy that connection. I've also met people at Knepp who have used some really colourful languages about how much they dislike it and how much they preferred it when it was a neat and tidy farm some point in the past. Now, people are going to be different and experience different things, and I think that diversity is important. I think there are some principles for implementing a rewilding project in the UK, and I think that's the first one is really about this kind of concept of giving up that control and management. It's really accepting the outcomes of nature looking after itself. You might have your favorite habitat, you might have your favorite species. I think rewilding is a part of the fun is not making decisions just to benefit what you would like, but rather just see where nature takes its course and see how it surprises you, see how much it can excite it and by delivering the unexpected. And I think that's really important from a biodiversity perspective as well, because I'm sure there's lots of species out there that don't feature that highly on people's priorities. You know, mammals and birds might do all right, but who's thinking about the slime molds? It's often how I describe it. And I kind of think that rewilding might be quite good for at least some species that don't get all the attention all the time. While rewilding might be stepping back and letting nature take its course, I often think it includes actions to kickstart ecological processes. So taking an action to restore that complexity when we don't think it can happen by itself. Things like reintroducing a species when there's no connectivity for that species to get there by itself. And I think there's going to be human management of rewilding projects most of the time, and I think that's going to happen in order to avoid some really undesirable or what might be considered to be unacceptable outcomes for people and nature. And I think that's just very pragmatic and going to be needed, and we shouldn't worry about that too much. But I kind of feel like the more you're managing and influencing that ecosystem, the less rewilding it is. But that doesn't necessarily matter. You know, just being we don't have to hold too closely to that goal in itself. Now, I think there's a lot of general agreement around what rewilding has to offer around the restoration of natural processes and this restoring these more complex and wild ecosystems. I think there's a lot of people can get behind there. I think where the disagreements come around, and if you're aware of the rewilding debate, there's people get quite confrontational about what they think isn't rewilding or what it should and shouldn't be doing. And I think most of that disagreement comes around the actions people take to get rewilding started. So some people want to take a passive approach and feel like any kind of human interference at the start is not really consistent with that. But I see the opportunity to do species reintroductions or translocations to restore particular ecological functions. Something like the wild boar and its rooting behavior can be really important to get that complexity back into the ecosystem. Beaver, another classic example. Not everyone would agree with that, but I think many would. More controversially, there's the idea of kind of translocating species that maybe haven't been present in a place before, but they may replace a species that is now extinct. And it's again about bringing back the function as opposed to the species. So you're replacing a lost species, but you're reintroducing the function in that case, the process that species is bringing. There can be species removal and management. So if you've got invasive species that haven't been native and having a really strong impact on the ecosystem, having a negative impact on the ecosystem, you might want to remove that species. Again, it doesn't have to be the case. You know, the people have on mind that, you know, this idea of novel ecosystem, people just accepting the species that happen to be present. I think that's fine. I think you can take multiple different routes along your rewilding journey. We can do things like restoring soil and water systems. We can remove human infrastructure, and we can change human activity in a place to avoid humans determining the outcome. Things like changing from agriculture and mining and extractive industries to something that's more about interaction and less about kind of domination and control. So something like tourism might have a lower footprint that still allows people to interact with that environment, but not dominate the system quite so much. So I think these are all actions we can take. You don't have to take them. They tend to start at the start of a project to get the system back into its kind of more complex state and then allow nature to take its course. I've also put in something that I feel like what rewilding isn't. And I don't think rewilding is consistent with this idea of habitat restoration to support habitats that might be considered particularly valuable, to support species that might be rare and seen as important. That's not to say I don't think this form of restoration isn't important. I really feel like ecological restoration to restore rare habitats and support threatened species is really important. But I feel like there's an opportunity to differentiate rewilding from more traditional forms of ecological restoration that makes it quite complementary. And we put this figure together to just highlight the kind of multiple journeys you can go through in this process of nature recovery. So if you have degraded land that's essentially might have been producing food for a long time and treated pretty harshly in terms of, you know, lots of disruption and ploughing, lots of fertilizer and pesticide use, there's very different options you can take in helping nature recover on that land. And we've highlighted a few here, such as regenerative agriculture, which is kind of inspired by natural processes, but still aimed at producing food. You can take that more targeted habitat restoration and restore it maybe to a particularly threatened or rare habitat, a really important idea, but just not necessarily as in keeping not what I think of as rewilding. I think rewilding brings this added dimension of this lack of control, or a reduction in control, just to see where nature takes its course. And it might not lead you to a rare habitat, but it might deliver something unexpected and still just as valuable. You can do things like sustainable forestry and nature-based solutions, where they've got, again, targeted outcomes to benefit people that might also help benefit nature as well. And I think we spend a long time in conservation kind of disagreeing with each other and kind of having strong views about what should and shouldn't be done in conservation. But it occurs to me that when you're looking after biodiversity, and diversity being the key word there, having lots of different approaches to doing things, lots of kind of diverse options for land management, employing that diversity is probably going to help you achieve your goal of restoring or conserving biodiversity. I.e., diversity creates diversity. And I feel like while we might all have our own personal interests and passions, we should hopefully respect and value everybody else's as well, to as much as possible, to see that actually taking lots of different approaches is probably going to create this diverse landscape of the future. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of in terms of what rewilding is and isn't, I guess. So the next question we can ask is, how do we create self-sustaining and complex ecosystems? One of the things that comes up about rewilding is you can't recreate the past. Well, I don't think rewilding is trying to recreate the past, but I do think we can learn a lot from the past and use it for inspiration for rewilding the future. And I want to take you on a quick kind of time travel journey. I'm going to show you a kind of a graphic short story, and that graphic short story is based on some research I did a few years ago now, using beetle data, paleo beetle data, to reconstruct past environments. And I think it creates something that's quite informative and inspiring for thinking about how the future might pan out. So I want to go back in time to the last interglacial, about 125,000 years ago, and this is what the South Down region may have looked like back then. And it's a really interesting time period because it's the last time the climate was quite similar to today, so in this interglacial warm climate period. It was also the period before modern humans, i.e. Homo sapiens, had ever set foot in Britain. And there's some really obvious differences. So firstly, the megafauna that was present was pretty fantastical. We had the straight-tusked elephant, larger than the elephants that still exist today. We have the giant deer that had antlers 2 meters long on each side of its head. We had narrow-nosed rhinoceros. We had species that we're more familiar with, like the wild boar. And the landscape that the kind of beetle community suggests was present at that time was one of a real mixed mosaic of vegetation structures. So we had, evidence of beetles that really like more closed canopy foresty conditions. We had beetle communities that liked open grassland with lots of dung that had, plenty of sun. And we had this kind of wood pasture landscape, and we had a mix. And what was really telling was this: we had lots of dung beetles, lots of beetles associated with large amounts of dung, suggesting you've got this really rich and abundant large herbivore community. And you've got this really diverse vegetation structure. And I think the key thing to remember here, or the key take home for me, was that many of the species that we're trying to conserve today are used to, were in this landscape 125,000 years ago. So the species we're trying to conserve today evolved under the conditions of landscapes that were partly shaped by this megafaunal community. If we jump forward to 40,000 years ago, we're kind of in the middle of the last glacial period. We're not at the last glacial maximum, but we kind of use this period as a nice opportunity to test how well our beetle data was doing, because we're expecting lower herbivore abundances, so less dung beetles for this period because of the productivity of the system. We also expect fewer trees within the landscape, and we found that within the dung beetle community. So it's kind of good suggestions that we've got this nice rich landscape, but it's very different based on the climatic conditions at the time. It's also a key moment because Homo sapiens, modern humans, are arriving, and this expansion of Homo sapiens across the world as we expanded out of Africa seemed to coincide with this megafauna extinction of the Pleistocene. Now, there may have been some climatic factors in there, but there's also some good evidence to suggest that the spread of Homo sapiens really changed the ecosystem in quite a dramatic way by helping to drive the megafauna extinct. And we've got a really different assemblage there. If we jump forward again to about 10,000, 7,500 years ago, around here, we're back into a warm period. We're in the Holocene, but we've lost the largest of the megafauna. We've no longer got the straight-tusked elephant. There's no hippos in the Thames anymore. We still have some fantastic beasts like the oryx. We've got various deer species. We've got some big predators like wolves and lynx, but we've lost the lion. We've also got modern humans now present as hunter-gatherers in the landscape. And what the beetle community is suggesting here is that we've actually got a more treed landscape. We've got more representation of closed woodland. We've still got some open patches. We've got some open glades. And you would imagine the big herbivores are still making a difference here and impacting the way the ecosystem is functioning. But it doesn't seem quite as open and quite as the diverse mix that you had from that last interglacial period. And that might well be because the large herbivore numbers might have been suppressed by your your hunter-gatherers and your large predators, because you've lost the biggest herbivores, the ones that are pretty immune, certainly as adults, from predation. So you seem to have changed the system quite a lot. And while you've still got the large, so the species here today that you had previously, you've probably got them in different compositions, represented the different habitats that are available. Now we can jump forward again, and I found this particularly interesting, that if we come into this late Holocene period, 2,500 years ago, we've now got humans, agriculture has essentially arrived into the UK. We've brought various livestock species. We're really pushing aside the larger wild mammals at this time. But this need to feed livestock is and grow crops is meaning that humans are starting to clear woodland and actually diversify the vegetation structure, creating what actually is a very similar landscape in terms of its structure, in terms of how much of these different woodland categories and different open ground areas. It's much more similar to the last interglacial than the late Holocene is to the last interglacial. And it might be that humans are almost replacing the activities of the biggest herbivores at the time. So the activities of straight-tusked elephants pushing over trees and really browsing and disrupting tree growth, you've almost got humans taking on that role in this period of really low intensity agriculture. So in some ways, I find this quite inspiring in the interests of thinking about conservation and the next steps in the future. And that you've got this last interglacial environment where you've got this really abundant and diverse megafauna community that seems to be quite related to this really diverse mix of mosaic of vegetation. That's quite similar to this late Holocene, early Holocene period. So I'm getting my earlies and lates mixed up here. We've got this late Holocene, about 2,500 years ago, where humans might be having. I kind of feel like this might be an interesting comparison to what might be regenerative agriculture in this late Holocene period, and this more Pleistocene rewilding idea in the last interglacial. If we come forward to the present day, obviously there's got a major change from 2,500 years ago by the arrival of industrial agriculture. You know, we've really pushed nature to the edge, to the margins, small protected areas, very high livestock densities, big crop ambitions, covering over 70% of the country. So we've really changed that system. And I guess what rewilding is all about is, what does the next chapter look like? And what I want to explore for the rest of this talk is, what might we achieve by restoring this large mammal community, and how might that interact with vegetation, and change the vegetation structure, and what implications that might have for biodiversity. So really looking at this kind of dynamics between large herbivores in particular, obviously large predators are important as well, and the vegetation that's growing up in between. And this is this idea of kind of the green world hypothesis. How much important does vegetation determine what grows? Does it just grow and the process of succession drive what landscape looks like today, versus how important is these top-down processes? How important is browsing and grazing and rooting in terms of determining what the vegetation will look like? And this kind of this dynamic balance between those two processes, and how important it is, I think, is a really fascinating question for how that might work today, how it might work in the future, and how it might have worked in the past. So another way of showing this kind of large herbivore community, for this figure was created for Western Europe, so I've taken a few species out for the UK, but kind of shows quite nicely how the ecosystems of the past has some really diverse large herbivore communities that represented grazers, mixed feeders, and browsers. So you've got different traits in the way these herbivores are feeding, where they're kind of feeding off woody vegetation or their grasses and forbs. And we've got this big diversity. You've got some really large animals in there. You've got a real mix, and you can see that as time goes on, as we come into this early and mid-Holocene, we've lost your megafauna. We come into this late, we've lost a few more species from Western Europe as well. And when we come into the most recent, we've really lost most of our large wild animals, and we've brought in a lot of livestock into those places. If we come into the current, well, until recently, we'd lost beavers and wild boar in the UK as well, but they are coming back. And we can think about in the future, what might different herbivore communities look like, and what implications might they have for the way nature works. And we can't recreate the past. The species aren't really available to do that. We might be able to do some taxon substitution if we wanted, but understanding how this kind of interactions of grazers and browsers and rooters and other traits that these large herbivores have could be quite telling for the future. So what I want to do is compare and contrast a couple of different questions, I guess, from two case study sites that I'm reasonably familiar with. So Allerdale, which is where I was doing my PhD research quite a few years ago now, we revisited last year with a couple of master's students, and we collected some data to see what the impact of rooting was kind of 10, 11 years later. So we'll go into that a little bit, but we also want to talk about Knepp, which also has a nice opportunity to explore how different ways of doing rewilding might result in different outcomes. So for the first case study, we're going to look at Knepp. So Knepp isn't too far away from me down here in Sussex. It's about 20 minutes from Brighton. And it's been a rewilding project since about 2000, 2001. And we want to explore here is how does large herbivore diversity and abundance influence vegetation structure? Now, the way Knepp is set up is it's about a 3,500 acre site. There's various roads running through it. And what essentially has happened is they've created a number of blocks or fenced areas within the wider Knepp area. And it's mostly in three, but I've been looking at two of these blocks. The southern block down here in pink, which gets most of the attention from the rewilding side of things. But there's also the northern block up here, which is about half the size, but it's had a different kind of rewilding history that is interesting to explore and compare. You may be able to see some of these dots with some numbers. These are monitoring plots I set up a couple of years ago with a camera trap, occasional audio moth to record the sounds of nature. I've been doing some kind of localized LiDAR to map the 3D structure of the vegetation there, and trying to collect some data to see what processes are happening at these sites and how do these two areas compare. I think I mentioned that these areas are fenced, and they're fenced to allow the reintroduction of some large herbivores. And fence is partly necessary there because the site is right on the boundaries of the A24, and you could imagine that a large number of large herbivores wandering onto a fast dual carriageway A road could be quite difficult, cause some problems. But the large herbivore community that's been introduced to those two blocks is quite different. And I've got a little graph here to try and show that. So on the top here, we've got what's in the northern block, and in the bottom here, we've got what's in the southern block. Along the bottom axis, the x-axis down here, we've got year, and we've got on the y-axis, we've got the density of the large herbivore community and the number of individuals per square kilometre. So you can see on the bottom, the rewilding started fairly early on in kind of 2001. Various fields started to be taken out of production over the first few years, but they didn't have any funding to put the fence up. So there were no large herbivores were introduced to that site. There were a few roe deer running around, but no introduction of large herbivores till getting on for 2008, 2009, and various large herbivores were introduced, and then you can see how their population has changed with large numbers of longhorned cattle for a short period and then reduced. We have some fallow deer, we've also got red deer, we've got Tamworth pigs, and we've got some Exmoor ponies. So we've got this quite diverse assemblage of large herbivores present in the southern block. But importantly, there was this period where there was no large herbivores, or very few large herbivores present other than roe deer. In contrast to the northern block, the rewilding started a little bit later. There was a fence put around the site straight away, and longhorn cattle were introduced with almost no period between taking the site out of production and reintroducing the large herbivores. The numbers then increased of the longhorn cattle quite high, to much higher densities for the most part than is in the southern block. But no other species were introduced. Occasionally fallow deer make it in there. So you've got this no period of time without large herbivores, and then you've got quite high densities. And you can see the difference in biomass density is quite striking, with longhorn cattle just being a much larger animal than any of these other large herbivores. In terms of like biomass density, it's much higher in the northern block, apart from this short period in the southern block. So there's a higher large herbivore biomass density in the northern block. So there's lots of grazing potential, but there's not much diversity. The other thing to look at and think about is just the fact that the southern block, we got some data from the southern block, some work done by Tom Dando, a master student of mine from a few years ago, looking at camera traps and other methods to assess where the large herbivores were spending their time. So each field here is shaded a shade of yellow to orangey brown, with the dark colors representing more time or more activity by that large herbivore in that space. So you can see there's quite a mix where large herbivores are not uniformly spending their time over the entire site. So if you think the diversity of traits these different species have, whether, for example, whether they graze or browse or root or bark strip, for example, these are happening in different intensities in different parts of the estate of the block. So nature's not working in the same place in all this, in the same way in all the places around. So we've got this kind of diversity happening as well. What we're interested in here, I think, I was interested in, what's this difference in outcome now that we're 20 or so years down the line? How does the northern block compare to the southern block with this kind of two starting conditions? So this is on the LiDAR data we have for the site in its kind of raw form. On the left-hand side, we've got a couple of representative maps or images of what many of the southern block plot looks like. And what you can see here is various trees growing. These lighter colored areas are taller vegetation, and you have lots of things going on in terms of, you have some palatable vegetation, you have some unpalatable vegetation, creating a bit more structural diversity. You get these big mounds of bramble, and they act as these nursery plants to allow trees to start getting established. And this kind of mix of conditions in the southern block is quite common. In the northern block, the sites look much more like this top version, where you have much more palatable grass vegetation with maybe a few areas that are or slightly less palatable, like thistles getting established. But you have a much more consistent kind of grassy vegetation over much larger areas. There are places in the northern block that look a bit more like this, where we've got some thorny scrubby species establishing, but they are much less common in the northern block. And if we look at some of the data, this is looking at how much the vegetation height varies within a plot. So this is the standard deviation of vegetation height. What this essentially means is in the southern block, you've got much more variability in the vegetation height, because you've got more trees, more shrubs mixed with lower vegetation. Whereas in the northern block, you've just got lower vegetation that's more grazed more consistently. If you then look at some plant species richness in these two blocks, what we find is the southern block tends to have a higher plant species of the ground vegetation, have a higher plant species richness of ground vegetation, and to a certain degree in the scrub vegetation as well. So this contrasting outcomes is creating this more scrubby and more diverse vegetation in the southern block, seems to be associated with at least more plant species richness. We've also been putting out some audio moths to catch some of the songbirds and the calls they're making, to see if we can kind of characterize the diversity of the bird community in those areas. And what we see here is on over a 24-hour period, we've had these devices called audio moths. They've been recording the sound around them. We then process it to look at the diversity of sound within that recording. So they're all in like minute-long recordings. And you can see overnight, there's not too much happening most of the places. You then hit the dawn chorus and everything gets kicks off, and you get this really fantastic fantastic dawn chorus at Knepp. You know, it's quite famous now, and you're really getting, you know, this real diversity of birds singing their little hearts out, and it's fantastic to listen to. And you can see here in the southern block, you get this kind of sharp increase, and then it fades out during the day. But you're also getting a really good dawn chorus in the northern block as well. And I haven't done all the analysis on this yet. There's a bit of a suggestion that the southern block is recording higher diversity of sounds, especially during the dawn chorus, suggesting there's a higher species richness and abundance and activity of songbirds. So again, suggesting that there's a bit more going on in the southern block that might be related to that greater diversity of habitat. One of the important points that doesn't really come across in these slides is that just because there's more diversity of sound in one place, that doesn't mean the same species are thriving in the same places. You might get different abundances of different species in those spaces. We haven't gone into the detail of this data. So just because one is more diverse than the other doesn't mean you're not benefiting from both being present and being different, i.e. different species might be thriving in the northern block than in the southern block. So their kind of combination means they are greater value than having the whole area of the southern block, for example. So what we're seeing here is how do large herbivore density and abundance influence vegetation structure? Well, in this northern block, where there's a higher biomass density and no period of low herbivore abundance, we do seem to have a more uniform ecosystem that's more grass dominated, with signs that things might be changing at the moment, and maybe slightly associated with slightly lower species richness, or at least preliminary data suggests. Whereas in the southern block, this kind of period of low herbivore abundance, followed by this diverse herbivore community, seems to be creating some diversity here. It's not totally clear in this photograph, but you can see some of these nice big bramble bushes. You've got some unpalatable vegetation here. You've got some more grassy areas. This slightly darker green area was heavily rooted, and again, it's got a different plant community growing there. So you've got diversity kind of baked into the mix here. Looking at Allerdale, I kind of wanted to look at this idea of rooting, which is the kind of a key part of my PhD, and see what happens when we come back to a later date, and really see how rooting in different conditions might result in different outcomes. So we did lots of data collection for the rooting during my PhD. We were kind of looking at what time of year rooting was happening, and it really happens in the autumn and winter while the ground is nice and wet and there's not much else to eat. Rooting behavior is quite varied, so you can have this kind of shallow exploratory, just sticking your nose in and lifting up and see what might be under there, to this deep excavation of deep rooting where you're getting into the rhizomes, often in kind of bracken dominated areas, and really excavating quite large areas. Wild boar can root quite a large area individually each week, so we kind of fence them into an area and monitor the rate of bare ground creation, and they seem to be rooting in terms of tens to hundreds of meters squared per boar per week. The difference related to the soil conditions, so there was heavy rain between week 6 and week 7, which dramatically increased their capacity to root large areas. They were rooting in some different places, so they were rooting in bracken vegetation. And one they rooted in here, they set up some small exclosures. So they were 2 by 2 meters, was keep the wild boar out. We put 10 of those in areas that had been heavily rooted, and we put 10 of them in areas nearby that hadn't been rooted, to try and compare what was going on at the time. And we were able to revisit those 11 years later to see what the impact was. So if you look at bracken cover, so dead bracken cover, so when bracken is growing, it creates this lot of dead vegetation layer as the old fronds die each year, and it creates this thick mat. Where bracken is really dominant, you get this very high dominance of very high cover of dead bracken, as you can see here in this unrooted zone. Whereas in the rooted area, the wild boar have really cleared it all out and reduced it to a small fraction of what it was before. And that's 1 year after rooting, 2 years after rooting, and we still saw that 11 years later. So we can still see here in 2021 this big difference in our plots. And there hadn't been any rooting since, but you can see there's been this quite clear change. And this is what I mean by the different vegetation. And what we'd really seen was where a lot of sites had been bracken dominated, they'd become much more heather dominated at a later date, this 11 years later. But in that process, we're still seeing higher plant species richness in these rooted areas compared to the bracken zone. So bringing in a large mammal rooting up the ground can really change the ecosystem, or what's going on at that particular patch, and have an impact on a lasting impact on the ecosystem as a whole. We also put them into this more heather and grass dominated area. This is these small like half-hectare enclosures. We put them in at different densities. And again, we monitored what the plant species richness was doing in those areas. In this case, we had a slightly different setup. We had, in 2008 was before wild boar was stocked. This is the species richness in 2008, so it's very variable, but reasonably high. Immediately after rooting, as you might expect, it's quite destructive. They've really reduced species richness by creating lots of bare ground. In 2010, things hadn't recovered that much, but you could see it was increasing. And in 2021, it was still below what we were seeing in 2008. We were there quite early in the season in 2021, and it was a cold late spring, so it might have some influence of why we're seeing a reduction there. But what we're seeing here is that you've got this impact of this rooting, and it hasn't had a big impact on the vegetation. And what's come back, it seems to be slightly less diverse than what was there before in this case. And interestingly, we compared different types of ground preparation. Essentially, we had some fenced and planted in two areas, fenced and rooted and planted in another, and we compared that to some unfenced areas that were grazed by red deer and cattle primarily. And what we found was there was no real difference between that rooting behavior and other kind of planting means. And I suspect it's something to do with the fact that, again, we've excluded large herbivores here for 11 years and got lower plant species richness as a result, and larger and a bigger impact here. So does the same process result in the same outcomes? No, rooting in different vegetation communities seems to result in some different impacts on the ecosystem as a whole. So yeah, so you've got quite different things going on. So the context makes a big difference, and I think that's important. I think I'm getting close to my allotted time, but I just want to last example of I think the importance of thinking about rewilding for the UK is, there's a lot of question around, do we have overgrazing and overbrowsing problem in the UK? Have we got too many wild large herbivores, particularly up in the Scottish Highlands? I suppose this gets a lot of attention up there. And are they a problem? Are they a reason for the ecosystem not adapting? Do we just have too many? And this kind of leads to the question of, what are natural densities of large herbivores? What can we expect under a rewilding system? And have we got our system currently, is it totally unnatural? And you can see a lot of discussion in the media and other places that there is this perception that we just have far too many red deer and sheep as well. And they are the problem for the reason that we haven't got the regeneration of the Caledonian forest. But this got us a research group, a group of researchers really thinking about, well, what can you expect in terms of large herbivore density in any particular place? And we collected some macro scale data from protected areas around the world and put this figure together, which is looking at the relationship between net primary productivity, so basically how much vegetation is there to eat, and we thought it would likely be related to large herbivore biomass. So if there's lots of vegetation to eat, we expect more large herbivores present to eat it. Now, we really found that in African protected areas, there's this strong positive correlation between there's net primary productivity, and large herbivore biomass. So in our most protected areas, kind of these most intact ecosystems with these really large herbivore communities, it's a strong positive relationship. Interestingly, elsewhere, such as North America here in blue, we had a positive relationship, but at a much lower level than you would expect for Africa. And then in Europe, we don't really have that relationship. And it's quite interesting here, these points in green down here tend to be our protected areas, and up here tend to be our rewilding sites. So you've got this real divergent idea about what might be natural levels of large herbivores. And I wanted to compare this to my Allerdale experience to try and think about, well, what's going on at Allerdale, where I had some experience where we definitely felt we had too many deer for trees to grow, and I assume that might mean they are naturally high. So when I arrived at Allerdale, there was about 13 red deer per square kilometre, which equates to about this large herbivore biomass density. And what I thought was quite interesting is for the net primary productivity you get up at Allerdale, this 13 red deer per square kilometre is a lot less than you would expect to find in an African site, for example, at the same level of net primary productivity. To get trees growing, the figure that was always banded around was you need fewer than 5 red deer per square kilometre to allow trees to grow. So this is a major reduction. This is a logarithmic scale, so this is a big reduction in this large herbivore biomass. And I thought, it's quite interesting that you're taking it even further away from what you might expect to be possible for this level of net primary productivity for that ecosystem. And even under really high levels of deer density, which sometimes talked about 40 red deer per square kilometre, you're still not getting quite, you're then well within this kind of range of what you might expect for the African ecosystem. And I think what this is telling me is that it's not so much that our large herbivore densities are unnatural or unreasonably high. It's more that they're in a degraded ecosystem that doesn't have the opportunity for natural regeneration. And if you had rewilding in the Scottish Highlands, and if you had that period like we saw at Knepp, where we reduce red deer densities, it may allow the vegetation to bounce back, and that might create an environment that can support much higher densities of red deer in the future. And if you compared it to Knepp, for example, the Knepp southern block and northern block are kind of these much higher, these on the top end side of the biomass you might expect for the net primary productivity you find at Knepp. And you don't have a problem with tree regeneration here, for example, particularly in the southern block where you've got these protective nursery plants that are allowing trees to grow. So you've got there's quite big variation happening between what the Scottish Highlands and what's happening in southern England here. And I think it's really important to remember that nature is very variable, and we need to bear that in mind. So yeah, do we have a overgrazing or browsing problem in the UK? Well, my feeling is that densities of large herbivores that are considered to be far too high today might be considered low or very reasonable within a rewilded future. We need to remember that when we're dealing with degraded ecosystems now, we don't want to establish our baselines and fix those into the future. We want to allow nature to take its course. And if we decide to reduce red deer densities today to allow vegetation to bounce back, we shouldn't then seek to control red deer densities in the future necessarily. We might want to just let nature take its course and see what happens. So just to conclude, rewilding is a really diverse concept in itself, in the sense that you are giving over to nature to let nature work, and nature is diverse. It's a really fantastically, I think it's complicated, it's complex, it's exciting, it's dynamic, it's very interactive. It varies from place to place. So, any one vision for rewilding won't be the same. Varying it and the way you get it started is going to result in lots of different outcomes. And I think there's going to be some fascinating experiences and learning opportunities from that. And I think rewilding sits within this variety of ways we can do nature recovery. And that's something that we should be excited about. And while I'm an advocate of rewilding, I really support and want to see what's happening in regenerative agriculture and compare and contrast and see what we can learn from the process. And I hope this kind of this diversity of land management options and nature recovery options really might lead to this diverse outcomes that's going to meet the needs of people and nature, because nature is diverse and people are diverse. None of us are the same. None of us appreciate the same things. And yeah, I think that's an exciting future for us. So I want to wrap over there. I think I've gone over a little bit, so apologies for that. And just say thank you very much for listening. And thanks to loads of collaborators and contributors, particularly Daniel Locke and Betsy Gorman have done a lot of the artwork. And Dan Maud and Saul Ridley did a lot of the work up at Knepp, and others have contributed as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Would you like to de-share your...
Yes. Let me see if I get the controls back somewhere. It's the problem with hiding the controls. It's it makes it difficult to find them again. Sorry, give me a second. There we go. Stop share. Found it.
Great. Let me reorganise my screen now a bit. Okay, well, thank you very much for that excellent overview. Covered an awful lot of ground there. It's almost hard to know where to start in the Q&A. But let me just pick up, if I may, on a couple of things that occurred to me as you were going through. So going back to the beginning, in a sense, where you were looking at Knepp and comparing the north and southern blocks. You compared the presence of the megafauna, basically. Perhaps we should call it mesofauna. But what I was wondering was, is it a legitimate, fair comparison in terms of the terrain, the geology, and the hydrology? Are they similar?
Yeah, the northern and southern block are reasonably similar. They're on the kind of the clay, the wheeled clay for that area. There's not too much dissimilarity there. They've got some other. They've got reasonable histories in terms of both were mostly arable. They did have some pastoral agriculture in there as well, and they've also got a woodland mix. And there's probably a bit more woodland from the past in the northern block than there is in the southern, so it's not 100% comparable. There was also seeding that happened in the northern block, so there was some other restorative actions that I haven't gone into all the details of here. So are they an experimental perfect comparison? No, they're definitely not. They're also a very small sample size. So there's definitely differences there. And my purpose isn't, I guess, really to really throw at it as a strong experimental setup, but I think exploring the narrative and the stories of the two is quite interesting and important as well. And the data I think helps enrich that. But I do think it is quite important, this period of low herbivore abundance in the southern block, followed by a different outcome, because it just seemed to give the vegetation a reasonable a head start on getting things going. The importance of the seeding might also be really key. I'm not entirely sure. So no, it's not a totally fair comparison, but it's also an interesting one in my opinion.
Fair enough. Changing about a bit, one question that's come in from Alison is given the situation in England, that it's a fairly dense human population and so on, so there's questions about megafauna and predators and so on. Is it perhaps more useful to look at optimizing for microfauna in terms of invertebrates and so on? Should that be the guiding principle rather than the perhaps easier to count large things?
I guess this partly comes down to values and what you focus on. My personal interest is system wide. So I'm interested in the large herbivores for their impact on the microfauna, essentially. What is the trophic cascade relationship there? And sorry, my kid. Sorry, it sounds like something went horribly wrong just outside the other door. But I think it's okay.
Do you want to check? Feel free to go check.
I think my wife's there, and I think it's okay. But I'll run off if I need to.
Small mammals are allowed. Small mammals are allowed.
Yes, yeah, that was hopefully bedtime. But at the moment, I can hear wailing, so I think someone got too boisterous. So in my opinion, it's systems. While I'm focusing on the large mammal, it's not really for their conservation. It's more for their function. Wild boar species is doing really well. Don't need to worry too much about it from a conservation point of view. But its rooting impact is fascinating, and opportunities for giving other species. It feeds into the ecosystem, which I think is going to be good for the microfauna. I do think that, there's some also really interesting questions around this, because it comes up quite a lot, this idea. And there's an interesting paper recently that was highlighting the burden of responsibility for looking after megafauna is generally put into the global south, and megafauna are difficult to live with. But should we necessarily assume that they're the ones that the global south should be the ones that are looking after it all and taking responsibility for it? So I like us thinking more of an ecosystem scale approach, and I don't think you can necessarily conserve one thing without the other very effectively. I don't think there's enough funding or resources for people to take responsibility for every species in that way. So yeah, I think it's a complicated and interesting one, and it comes back to the fact that I totally think we should be doing some targeted restoration and conservation and working to preserve those rare species. But I think we can also get stuck into some rewilding in some places as well, and I think there's loads of opportunity for it. Britain is a densely populated in parts of the UK. It's very low density in others. I lived in a place in Allerdale, I think 7 miles from the next nearest building. We found a 1,500 square kilometre area that I think, if I remember correctly, from 10 years ago had 31 inhabited buildings in it. 1,500 square kilometres is, you're getting on for a decent national park size with 31 inhabited buildings. Not saying again that we should just do everything there. If we think about big animals, they are very capable of living alongside people, providing road density doesn't get too high, which it would be in certain places, and they're not actively persecuted. So I think they should be on the table, because I don't think human population density is a reason they can't be there, and part of the reason they should be on the table is for their function as much as anything else.
Okay. Coming right up to date, one thing I'd like to interrogate you on is what's your reaction to the news of bison arriving in Kent at the Wildwood Rewilding area?
So bison get a lot of attention from this, and it's one of those things where it comes down to the particular actions, and some people are really supportive and very excited about the bison reintroduction into a fairly small fenced area. Others think it's a total waste of time, money and effort, and are really against it. So full disclosure, I'm working with Kent Wildlife Trust. They asked if I want to do some monitoring over there and making some fantastic student projects, I think, out of some comparison between different large herbivore communities and seeing what they have on the vegetation. I'm quite excited. I think it's going to be cool to see how it works out. Is it a model for what we should be doing over the country? No, in the sense that it's small areas. There's only so much you can do. Is it getting people excited by nature conservation? Well, it's getting some people very excited and getting some people very upset. Comes back to, we have different values, different ideas. In general, big projects that are trying to do something a little bit different, I'm supportive of. On the basis that I think we're quite conservative in conservation. We have a habit of really trying to hold on to what we have, and I think we've got to a stage where we've got some great stuff, but we at the same time, we're one of the most degraded ecosystems in the world, and we really need to be thinking about restoration and innovation, and we've got some real opportunities to do that, I think, here. So, that's great. I support that, and I think it would be good to run with it. I mean, bison are interesting species in themselves. Whether this particular form of bison has been present in the UK or not in the past, I don't really care that much personally. I know other people really do. I think this kind of idea of novel communities is just a fact of life under climate change. It's going to happen. I think these ideas of working out what's a native species and what's a non-native species, we waste a lot of time and effort on it, in my opinion. And that's just my opinion. It doesn't mean people aren't entitled to have that opinion. It's just I happen to don't get inspired by it on the side that it's going to change. I'm often thinking, we're talking about non-native and invasive species coming into the country and having a big impact. An non-native species is a species that has been brought here by humans and kind of released to do its thing. Does that mean, every climate migrant that arrives because of human-caused climate change, we're categorizing those as non-native species? Except the fact they need to move somewhere, they're just responding to the climate. Another way of looking at it, species that are benefiting from, human migration are just organisms that are very well adapted to the current environment. And should we persecute those individuals just for making the most of an opportunity that happened to come their way? I don't know. I think it's a really complex area. I come into this kind of innovator, kind of challenge status quo, probably, thinking. I think others that are really questioning it and really, I think there's a risk for, if you wouldn't want to put me in charge of the crown jewels of British conservation, because I'm likely to take too much risk with it. I think there's other people much better set for trying to protect that. But I also think there needs to be people out there that are kind of challenging the ideas and pushing things forward and asking difficult questions. And I think a lot of conservation comes down to values rather than, objective, how do we support biodiversity? And I think if we really assessed it, I'd be fascinated to know what proportion of time do we argue about, I value one thing, you value another, as opposed to making objective decisions for biodiversity conservation. And I suspect a lot of it's the former rather than the latter. And that means we've got to have some hard conversations about it and get stuck into those. And I think, not worry about it, and maybe come to some new conclusions about what conservation will look like in the future. And it might not be the same as what we value right now.
Okay, one thing that may shed some light on that debate, should we call it, is this question that has come in from Paul Jeffrey, saying that he understands that you have a rewilding community in Sussex. So could you talk a little about what are the objectives of that, what sort of membership you have and your expectations, and is it something that we should think about replicating elsewhere in the country, in particular in Oxfordshire?
Okay, yeah, good question. So the history of rewilding Sussex is I came from living in the Scottish Highlands down to Sussex, and thinking about rewilding in the Scottish Highlands is somehow easier than thinking about rewilding in Sussex on the basis of scale and all those core areas. So I was really, wanted to, how do I do rewilding in my own backyard? Because I'm not a big fan of saying we should do it somewhere else for somebody else's problem. And the other side I really wanted to engage young people. So talking to people, at university, just out of university, I really felt like, there's a bit of a shift now in the way we perceive conservation. And I think the way we do things isn't going to, I feel like biodiversity conservation isn't working in the sense that we haven't stopped the decline of biodiversity. So we're going to need to challenge those ideas. I mean, there's successes, there's things to celebrate, but ultimately we haven't worked it out. So I really wanted to engage a young community that was going to be coming into the future and exploring. So the Rewilding Sussex membership is probably more young people, universities, 20s, 30s kind of age group. The objectives, I want to I would like universities all across the country to have invest in a patch of land to rewild or restore in one way or another. I think it would be brilliant for education. I think it would be brilliant for science, to see how we do nature recovery in all the different places around the country, because we've got a huge number of universities. I feel like education of conservation in the classroom can only take you so far. It's not until you start having to make decisions that you really understand the complexities and difficulties, and the fact there's so many different perspectives and stakeholders and viewpoints and needs out of a landscape. And I'd love to get, areas where young people get involved, visit a site on a regular basis in the decision making. So you might put some boundaries on what those decision making can be, but you get young people in that educational role from university and the wider community, really thinking about, okay, what are we going to do here? What are we going to decide for this patch of land? Are we going to let it go wild? Are we going to restore a particular habitat type? What are the costs and benefits? Just be an amazing educational opportunity. But it also links to things like carbon sequestration. How are we going to offset carbon emissions from university once we've got it down to an absolute minimum and can't avoid any more? So that carbon offsetting that net zero in the way it's intended rather than the way it can be applied. And I love the idea of young people investing then the learning and connection to a patch of land that they can come back to year on year in the future and see how it changes and see how it evolves. And that partly comes from, because it took me a really long time growing up in my landscape to really question the landscape I was living in. I just assumed it'd always been like that. Really, I never really thought about what it was like, what it could be like, what's the implications of the decisions now. So just things like looking at land, ownership in the country is fascinating. The amount of land owned by relatively small people. I always thought that was a Scottish Highland thing. I hadn't really realised it applied so much to the south of England. So there's so much in there. I just want to feel like the next generations needs a bigger stake in the countryside, one way or another, whether that's working with current land ownership, whether that's universities might be a good opportunity to try something new. So I think that'd be a big one, but I also want to get involved in more species reintroductions, and as well, I got invited to give a class to a group of 8-year-olds because they'd done a session on wolves, and their teacher had heard about rewilding and came across my name, and I presented to a group of 30 or 40 8-year-olds, and I've never had a more engaged, more enthusiastic audience ever. Before I'd even opened my mouth, 5 hands went up with questions. They were incredibly knowledgeable. Their teacher had just done this amazing job about all this, the Pleistocene side of it, and they were kind of like, so Chris, how many species have you reintroduced? We want to see all of this ecosystem back and restored and doing its thing. And I have to say, I haven't introduced any. I haven't made that tangible contribution. And they were like, why not? And it's like, well, it's quite complicated. Well, is it that complicated? Can't you just get on and do it? And I'm like, well, you can actually. I mean, there was a couple of 18-year-olds that wanted to do it with reptiles and amphibians, and it caused a big Twitter storm. So that energy that came in, and enthusiasm, and we got them to do a little exercise about what the future of the landscape should look like, and there was more wildlife and less litter. I was like, well, that's a couple of fantastic policies, and they're 8, they've really got it down. So I'd love to see, would any of these 8-year-olds like to be PM? I see Alison is messy. And I mean, honestly, I do feel like we lose some of that enthusiasm, and we get a little bit too knowledgeable about, we get that dangerously small amount of knowledge on the things we like, and we make a lot of decisions about that rather than having this kind of, let's just challenge the status quo. I consider myself a David Attenborough naturalist. I didn't have a connection to wildlife in my youth. I had a nice garden, but it was manicured. There was not that variety. I saw wildlife on the TV through David Attenborough's, and it was always far and distant. And I think part of the reason I'm interested in rewilding is why does wildness and this idea of natural marvels need to be abroad and somebody else to look after? There's no reason why we can't challenge that and see it. That doesn't mean food production isn't really important. totally is. I'm not trying to say that, but if we can find a big patch that the local community could get inspired and share that vision, and you get a majority in favor of that, why not? And if we want to set up multiple groups, I always wanted to set up, a network of local organizations, really pushing the boundaries, and it's already happening. There's a bunch of people doing some great things, and I think there's definitely some things I've seen from Oxfordshire before, and the more we can support each other to get involved and do things, the better. And I, in my opinion, and we'll make some mistakes along the way, but I don't know. I think inaction is as much of a mistake as slightly too enthusiastic action. Oh, I think you might be muted, but I can't hear you now.
Sorry, my fault. I don't know if you just noticed, but Richard Tilley has come in with an auxiliary question of what you were just saying about if lots of people were to take on a patch of land, if all universities or whatever, realistically, how big a patch of land do you need to be useful?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we recently moved house, and I've got a garden out back, and we wanted to see what you can do in a wild rewilding patch in my back garden, which is probably 6 meters by 6 meters, not the biggest area in the world. We planted some shrubberies around the outside, but I mimicked a wild boar on the laid lawn by basically just hacking into it as best I could, and I've done some seed dispersal, and we went from a bare wall to a green lawn that I couldn't see any diversity apart from maybe some crane flies coming up, to something that had a whole variety of things coming up in terms of plant life, lots of ragwort and other bits and pieces. But I put some camera traps up, and we got hedgehogs back, and I was absolutely delighted. I hadn't seen a hedgehog I saw, unfortunately, my last house, badgers got hold of one, so I found the carcass of one. So yeah, mammals interacting with each other doesn't always work out for the rare ones. For me, that's kind of this idea of this human interaction with a patch of land that's kind of mimicking nature. So I can't put a wild boar in there; it's just not big enough. It's not sensible. But I can have some fun. I think you've got the next speaker next time is that reconnecting with the role of what animals do and understanding. I think you can have some real fun with that. Now, a lot of people say that's just not rewilding, Chris. And that's fine. I understand why people think that. I think this idea of humans, not managing with a goal. I'm not trying to create. I didn't decide what was going to grow on my lawn, apart from maybe I think I did sprinkle some yellow rattle for that kind of parasitic relationship with the grasses, which I thought would be fun. But I also just did some random things, created some bare ground, walked around it after walking in a field and just see what comes up. And the amount we do the City Nature Challenge, and just seeing the number of invertebrates and the microfauna, it's fantastic. And my kids like crawling through it, and it suddenly creates a 3D landscape. So for me, that's rewilding in the sense I'm just letting nature take its course, and I'm interacting as a big mammal in there, and it's a lot of fun. It's a great way of connecting people. Whether it's going to have a big impact on biodiversity or not, I doubt it. It's certainly got higher species richness than it had before. If the question is more aimed at what can we do on a patch of land, I'd love 200 hectares as a semi-minimum, because you can do some stuff with some big mammals, and I think it adds to the interest of the site. It's not totally wild. It's certainly got a bunch of human activity in there, but Knepp's northern block is something like 215 hectares. You can get into that landscape. It doesn't feel like it's completely free, and I mean the southern block at I think 450 odd hectares, you can really get lost in that because it's so flat and there's no features. You can really feel like it's a really quite big space. But with the land prices around here, you're talking about a lot of cash. So that would be, I think, a great minimum to play with. But I think the idea of rewilding, you can either be more active or more passive. The smaller you are, the more you're just letting nature you can't take too many remedial actions to restore species. The bigger you get, the more species you can add, and if you can find some space to do some large carnivores, then you're really laughing. That 1,000 square kilometers up in Scotland, you can do a lot in that space. It's still not totally wild, but I mean, if you consider Isle Royale is 544 square kilometers and had a population of bulls for 50 years. Okay, they've got some genetic inbreeding, they're probably about to go extinct without, but still 50 years of some pretty fascinating stuff. So nature works on basically all spatial scales. So in that sense, I feel like rewilding can as well. Even from your garden, you can have a little patch doing its own thing. Your little island in a river's got some interesting dynamics happening. But yeah, bigger's better. You've got more options. But I kind of feel like you can do it at any scale and get something interesting out of it.
Okay. All right. Well, that seems like a call to arms. That's a good place to finish. Thank you again, Chris.